Welcome to the walls of Château de Montfort in southern France in the year 1244, during the Albigensian Crusade, when the castle, a formidable fortress held by Cathar heretics, faces assault by the forces of King Louis IX of France, when medieval siege warfare has reached a sophisticated level, combining engineering, tactics, and sheer determination to overcome the massive stone defenses that dominate the military landscape of the era. For the next few hours, we will explore how medieval armies actually conducted sieges, how they breached castle walls through methods ranging from sophisticated siege engines to brutal direct assault, examining the engineering knowledge, the tactical approaches, and the harsh realities of siege warfare that defined military operations in the age of castles. If you enjoy these detailed explorations of medieval warfare and the practical realities behind legendary battles, please like and subscribe to support our channel. Our story begins on a morning in late June, as the besieging army, approximately 3,000 men, including knights, men-at-arms, crossbowmen, and laborers, establishes its siege camp around the castle. The army is commanded by Guy de Levis, a veteran crusader who has participated in numerous sieges and understands both the difficulties and the methods required to take a fortified position. Château de Montfort sits on a rocky outcrop, rising perhaps 200 feet above the surrounding valley, its walls following the contours of the natural stone, creating a fortress that appears to grow from the mountain itself. The castle's defenses are formidable, walls averaging 30 feet high and 10 feet thick, constructed of massive limestone blocks, reinforced with 12 towers that project from the curtain wall, allowing defenders to shoot along the wall faces, a strong gatehouse protected by a barbican and drawbridge, and a garrison of approximately 500 defenders, including knights, sergeants, and crossbowmen. Taking such a fortress by direct assault would be extremely costly, perhaps impossible without overwhelming numerical superiority. Instead, Guy de Levis must employ siege warfare, a methodical approach combining blockade to starve the defenders, artillery bombardment to weaken the fortifications, mining to undermine walls, and eventually assault through breaches created by these various methods. The first task is establishing the siege camp. The army must position itself to blockade the castle while remaining protected from sorties by the defenders. Guy de Levis selects positions for his various divisions, placing them to cover all approaches to the castle, preventing anyone from entering or leaving without having to fight through the besiegers. Let us follow Sir Guillaume de Beaumont, a knight in his early 30s who commands a company of 50 mounted men-at-arms and sergeants. Guillaume has been assigned to establish his company's position on the western approach to the castle, blocking the road that leads down the valley toward the nearest town. Guillaume surveys the terrain carefully, looking for a defensible position with good visibility toward the castle and toward the valley, with access to water, with adequate space for his men and horses. He selects a slight rise approximately 500 yards from the castle walls, close enough to observe and control the approach, far enough to be reasonably safe from the castle's defensive artillery. "We'll dig in here," he tells his sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Pierre. "Earthworks to protect against sorties, tents for the men, corrals for the horses, latrines downslope from the water source, standard siege camp layout." The men begin digging, creating a defensive ditch surrounding the camp position, throwing the excavated earth inward to create a rampart topped with a palisade of sharpened stakes. This is backbreaking work in the June heat, made worse by the soldiers' armor and equipment, but it is essential. Without fortified camps, the besiegers would be vulnerable to night raids by the defenders, unable to maintain the blockade effectively. As Guillaume's men work on the fortifications, other elements of the army are establishing their own positions. The main siege camp, where Guy de Levis has his headquarters, is positioned on the eastern side of the castle, on ground that offers the best approach for siege engines and mining operations. The camp is a substantial undertaking, essentially building a temporary fortified town to house 3,000 men and their animals, supplies, and equipment. Tents are erected in organized rows. Cooking fires are established in designated areas. Latrines are dug, following careful protocols to prevent disease. Water sources are secured and protected. Forges are set up for the blacksmiths who will repair weapons and equipment throughout the siege. Storage areas are designated for food, for arrows and crossbow bolts, for the various supplies, that a siege consumes in vast quantities. The army has brought substantial supplies with it: wagons full of grain, barrels of wine and salted meat, fodder for the horses, and timber and iron for constructing siege equipment. But these supplies are finite, and the besiegers must also forage from the surrounding countryside, requisitioning food and materials from local villages, hunting game, establishing supply lines back to friendly territory. This logistical challenge is one of the most difficult aspects of siege warfare. An army of 3,000 men consumes enormous quantities of food and supplies. Perhaps 3 tons of food per day, thousands of gallons of water, fodder for hundreds of horses. Maintaining this supply over weeks or months of siege operations requires sophisticated organization and secure supply routes. While the camps are being established, the siege engineers are surveying the castle, identifying the best points for attack. The chief engineer is a master mason named Robert of Tours, an experienced craftsman who has worked on castle construction and who understands fortification design intimately, knowledge that makes him equally valuable for destroying fortifications. Robert walks slowly around the castle at a safe distance, studying the walls through a wooden frame marked with measurements, making notes on a wax tablet, discussing observations with his assistants. He is looking for weaknesses, sections of wall where the foundation might be vulnerable to mining, areas where the ground offers good positioning for siege engines, gates or towers that might be more susceptible to assault than others. The main gatehouse is too strong, he tells Guy de Levy during an evening council. Double walls, heavy oak gates, reinforced with iron, murder holes and machicolations above the approach. We could batter it eventually, but the cost would be enormous. The southeastern tower, however, Robert continues, pointing to his sketches, sits on ground that we can approach under cover of that ridge. We can bring siege engines close there, and the foundation appears to be on soil rather than bedrock, suitable for mining. Guy de Levy studies the drawings, considering the engineer's assessment. How long to establish battery positions for the siege engines? Perhaps a week to build the timber platforms and protective structures. Another week to construct the engines themselves. We have some prefabricated components, but much must be built on site. And mining? That depends on many factors: the soil conditions, whether we hit rock, whether the defenders detect and counter our mine. Perhaps 6 to 8 weeks to dig a gallery under the wall and prepare for collapse. This timeline, weeks to prepare, weeks to execute, is typical of medieval siege warfare. Sieges are slow, methodical operations that test patience as much as courage, that consume vast resources, that require sustaining large armies in the field for extended periods. Guy de Levy must balance multiple considerations. His army is expensive to maintain. The knights expect pay. The men-at-arms require provisions. The siege equipment consumes materials. The longer the siege lasts, the more it costs. But rushing the assault before adequate preparation could result in heavy casualties and failure. Begin the preparations, he decides. Establish the battery positions. Start construction of the siege engines. Begin the mining operations. We'll maintain the blockade and prepare for assault. If the defenders wish to surrender before we breach their walls, we'll offer reasonable terms. But we will take this castle, whether by negotiation or by force.
As the first day of the siege ends and darkness falls, the besieging army settles into its camps. Fires burn throughout the siege lines, creating a ring of light around the dark castle. Sentries are posted. Watches are organized. The army prepares for the long effort ahead. Inside the castle, the defenders watch the siege preparations with grim determination. They know they face months of hardship, short rations as supplies dwindle, constant vigilance against assault, the psychological stress of being surrounded and isolated. But they also know that the castle's fortifications are strong, that relief might come if they can hold out long enough, that surrender might mean execution as heretics. This is the beginning of the siege, not the dramatic battles of legend, but the patient, methodical establishment of positions and preparations that will eventually allow the besiegers to bring overwhelming force against specific points of the castle's defenses. The actual assaults, the breaching of walls, the desperate combats, all of these will come later, after weeks of preparation, engineering work, and the slow accumulation of advantages that will eventually make the castle's fall inevitable. After 2 weeks of preparation,
The besieging army has completed the initial phase of siege operations. The camps are fully established, the blockade is effective, and now the siege engineers are ready to deploy the artillery that will begin the systematic destruction of the castle's defenses. Let us follow Master Robert of Tours as he oversees the construction and deployment of the siege engines that will bombard Château de Montfort, examining the engineering principles, the construction methods, and the tactical employment of medieval siege artillery. The primary siege engines being constructed are trebuchets, massive counterweight-powered artillery pieces capable of hurling heavy stones hundreds of yards with devastating impact. Robert is supervising the construction of 3 trebuchets of different sizes, each designed for specific tactical purposes. The largest trebuchet, which the soldiers have nicknamed God's Stone Thrower, is a massive machine standing perhaps 50 feet tall when erected, built from oak timbers a foot thick, designed to throw stones weighing 300 pounds or more. This engine is intended for battering the castle's main walls, its heavy projectiles capable of cracking even thick masonry with repeated impacts. The construction site for God's Stone Thrower is a scene of intense activity. Carpenters are shaping massive timbers using axes and adzes, creating the precise joints required for the machine's framework. Blacksmiths are forging the iron pins and reinforcements that will hold the structure together under enormous stresses. Rope makers are twisting hemp into the heavy cordage that will serve various functions in the machine's operation. Robert stands at the center of this activity, directing the work with detailed instructions. The throwing arm must be 40 feet long, he tells the carpenters, with the pivot point positioned 1/3 of the way from the counterweight end. This ratio is crucial. Too close to the counterweight and we lose power, too far and the machine becomes unstable. The throwing arm is being constructed from a single massive timber selected for straightness and strength, reinforced with iron bands at stress points. At the counterweight end, a large box is constructed, a timber framework that will be filled with stones totaling perhaps 10 tons, providing the mass that will power the machine. The physics of the trebuchet are simple but effective. When released, the massive counterweight falls, pulling the short end of the throwing arm downward. This forces the long end of the arm upward in a sweeping arc, accelerating the projectile at the end of the arm. At the optimal moment in the swing, the projectile is released from a sling, flying toward the target with tremendous velocity. But achieving maximum performance requires careful engineering. The release mechanism, a hook that holds the sling until the optimal moment, must be precisely positioned and timed. The counterweight must be the right mass for the desired range. The throwing arm must be strong enough to withstand the stresses without breaking. The entire framework must be stable enough to prevent the machine from tearing itself apart during operation. Robert has built many trebuchets over his career and understands these requirements intimately. He checks every joint, every timber, every component, ensuring that the massive machine is being constructed to the exacting standards required. The counterweight box must be reinforced here, he points out to a carpenter. The forces during release are enormous. Inadequate bracing will cause failure. As God's Stone Thrower takes shape, 2 smaller trebuchets are also being constructed nearby. These lighter machines are designed to throw stones of 50 to 100 pounds, sacrificing impact power for faster reloading and greater accuracy. They will be used for more precise work, targeting specific towers or wall sections, shooting over the walls into the castle courtyard to harass the defenders. After approximately 10 days of intensive construction, the trebuchets are complete. Now comes the delicate work of positioning them for optimal effect. The machines must be placed where they can hit their targets, while remaining as protected as possible from defensive fire from the castle. Robert selects positions approximately 250 yards from the southeastern wall, close enough for accurate shooting, far enough to make defensive artillery less effective. But these positions are exposed to view and fire from the castle, so protective structures must be built. The siege engineers construct mantlets, large wooden screens covered with wet hides to resist fire, positioned to protect the trebuchets and their crews from arrows and from the castle's own defensive artillery. They also build timber platforms to provide stable footing for the massive machines, preventing them from sinking into the ground or shifting during operation. Once positioned and protected, the trebuchets must be tested and calibrated. This process involves loading the counterweight, loading progressively heavier projectiles, and observing where they fall, adjusting the release mechanism and other variables to achieve the desired range and accuracy. The first test shot from God's stone thrower is a dramatic moment. The massive counterweight is loaded with 5 tons of stones. A projectile, a roughly spherical stone weighing about 200 pounds, is placed in the sling. The crew, working under Robert's direction, pulls the throwing arm down using a windlass, locking it in place with the release hook. "Clear the impact area," Robert calls. "Release on my command." He waits for the wind to settle, for any defenders on the walls to be in covered positions where the projectile won't hit them. Wasting ammunition on individual soldiers is poor tactics. The goal is to damage fortifications. Release. A crewman pulls the release lever. The counterweight drops with a thunderous crash. The throwing arm whips upward with terrifying speed. The projectile flies from the sling, arcing through the air, covering the 250 yards to the castle in seconds. It strikes the southeastern tower, about 15 feet below the battlements, impacting with enormous force, creating a tremendous crash that echoes across the valley. The crew cheers, and Robert allows himself a slight smile. He examines the impact point through a viewing glass, noting that the stone has cracked several of the tower's facing stones, creating a visible crater in the wall. The damage is not catastrophic from a single shot, but it demonstrates that the machine is functioning correctly and can indeed damage the castle's masonry. "Reload," Robert orders. "We'll fire a full battery of 6 shots, then assess the effects and make adjustments." The reloading process takes approximately 15 minutes, lowering the throwing arm, removing the used projectile sling, installing a new one with a fresh stone, hauling the arm down to the cocked position. During this time, the other 2 trebuchets are also firing, their lighter projectiles arcing toward the castle at shorter intervals. The bombardment continues through the afternoon and into the evening. The crews develop rhythm and efficiency, reducing reload time slightly with practice. Stone after stone crashes against the southeastern tower, each impact creating more damage, cracking masonry, loosening mortar, gradually degrading the structure. By nightfall, perhaps 30 heavy stones and 50 lighter ones have struck the tower and the adjacent wall sections. The damage is visible. The tower's outer face shows numerous impact craters. Several stones have been knocked loose from the facing. Cracks are appearing in the mortar. But the wall still stands, still functional, its defensive capability only marginally reduced. This will be the pattern for weeks. Daily bombardment, gradual accumulation of damage, the slow destruction of the fortifications through repeated impacts. Medieval siege artillery lacks the explosive power of gunpowder weapons that will emerge in later centuries. So achieving decisive results requires patience and massive expenditure of ammunition. The defenders are not passive during this bombardment. The castle has its own defensive artillery. Several smaller trebuchets and springbalds, large crossbow-like weapons, positioned on the towers and walls. These weapons return fire, attempting to damage the besiegers' siege engines, to kill their crews, to disrupt the bombardment. But the defenders' artillery is at a disadvantage. They are shooting downward from the walls, which reduces range and accuracy. Their weapons are necessarily smaller than the besiegers' machines, because they must fit on the wall tops and towers, and their ammunition supply is limited to what was stockpiled before the siege began, while the besiegers can gather stones from the surrounding area almost indefinitely. One defensive shot does achieve success. A stone from a castle trebuchet strikes one of the besiegers' mantlets, smashing through the wooden screen and killing 2 crew members who were sheltering behind it. The crew scatters, and bombardment from that machine ceases, while repairs are made and replacement crew are assigned. Guy de Lavis observes the bombardment from his commander post, consulting regularly with Robert about the effects and the timeline for creating a breach. "How long until we can assault through the damaged section?" he asks. "Perhaps 3 more weeks of bombardment to create a gap large enough for assault," Robert estimates. "We're weakening the tower's foundation as well as its walls. Eventually a section will collapse, creating a slope of rubble that troops can climb to enter the castle. And if we supplement the artillery with mining, that could reduce the timeline significantly. If we can tunnel under the tower and collapse its foundation while the bombardment weakens the superstructure, we might create a breach in 2 weeks rather than 3. Guy de Levis considers this. Mining is dangerous work, subject to countermining by the defenders, potentially costly in lives. But it could shorten the siege significantly, reducing the strain on his supplies and the risk that the defenders might receive reinforcements. He decides, we'll pursue both approaches simultaneously. The combination should create our breach faster than either method alone. As night falls and the bombardment pauses, siege engines are difficult to operate accurately in darkness. The besieging army settles into the routine that will characterize the siege. Bombardment during daylight hours, maintenance and preparation during darkness, constant vigilance against sorties by the defenders, daily councils where the commanders assess progress and plan the next day's operations. The siege has entered its intensive phase, where engineering and persistence will gradually overcome the castle's formidable defenses, where the systematic application of medieval military technology will create the conditions for eventual assault and capture. While the trebuchets continue their daily bombardment, another form of attack begins, mining operations intended to undermine the castle's walls and create catastrophic collapse. This subterranean warfare is among the most dangerous and technically demanding aspects of medieval siege operations. Let us follow a mining crew led by a Welsh sapper named Dafydd ap Griffith, an experienced miner who has participated in sieges across France and the Holy Land. Observing the techniques, the dangers, and the grim determination required for this brutal work. The mining operation begins approximately 150 yards from the southeastern tower, far enough from the castle that the miners can begin their work in relative safety, protected from observation and interference by the defenders. A large tent is erected over the mine entrance, both to conceal the work and to provide shelter for the miners. Dafydd and his crew, 12 men, a mix of experienced miners and soldiers assigned to labor duty, begin excavating the mine shaft. The entrance is vertical at first, descending about 12 feet to reach bedrock level, then turning horizontal toward the castle wall. The work is exhausting and dangerous. The miners work in shifts, 2 or 3 men at a time working the tunnel face, while others haul out the excavated earth and shore up the tunnel with timber supports. The tunnel is barely large enough for a man to move through, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, a cramped space that becomes increasingly hot and airless as the tunnel extends. Dafydd works at the tunnel face, wielding a pick to break up the earth and rock, filling wicker baskets with the material. Another miner hauls the baskets back to the entrance, where they are emptied and returned. The work proceeds slowly, perhaps 3 or 4 feet per day when conditions are favorable, less when the miners hit rock that must be laboriously chipped away. Mind the roof, Dafydd calls back to his crew. I'm hearing creaking from the timbers. We need another support here. The timber shoring is critical to survival. Without it, the tunnel would collapse under the weight of earth above, burying the miners alive. Every few feet, the crew must stop excavating to install timber supports, vertical posts supporting horizontal beams, creating a framework that holds back the earth. The timbers themselves are prepared above ground, cut to standardized lengths to fit the tunnel dimensions. As the miners advance, a steady supply of timbers is sent down to them, along with mallets and iron spikes to secure the framework. The work is not only physically demanding, but psychologically stressful. The miners work in near total darkness, illuminated only by small oil lamps that consume the already limited oxygen. The tunnel is oppressively close, the air stale and difficult to breathe. The constant possibility of collapse creates pervasive anxiety. The work is so unpleasant that many soldiers would rather fight in open battle than descend into the mines. But the miners are motivated by both duty and reward. Guy de Levis has promised extra pay to the mining crews, and the prospect of plunder when the castle eventually falls provides additional incentive. After 2 weeks of grueling work, the mine has extended approximately 60 yards toward the castle. Dafydd estimates they are about halfway to their objective, a point directly under the southeastern tower's foundation, where they will excavate a large chamber and then collapse it to bring down the tower. But as the mine approaches the castle, a new danger emerges, countermining by the defenders. The castle's garrison, aware that mining operations are likely underway, has begun their own tunneling operations, attempting to locate and destroy the besiegers' mine. The first indication of countermining comes from sound.
David, working at the tunnel face one morning, stops and listens intently.
There is a faint, rhythmic sound, barely perceptible through the earth. The sound of picks striking stone, of men working underground, coming from somewhere off to the left of the main tunnel's direction. "Halt work," David orders quietly. Everyone silent. The crew stops, and in the sudden quiet they can all hear it, the unmistakable sound of tunneling, close by, perhaps 10 or 15 feet away through the earth. "Counterminers," David says grimly. "They're trying to find us, to break through into our tunnel, or to collapse it." This begins a deadly underground chess game. David must decide whether to continue advancing toward the objective, or to divert the tunnel to intercept the counterminers. If he continues straight ahead, the defenders might break through into his tunnel from the side, allowing armed men to attack the miners in the cramped space where combat favors the defenders. If he diverts to intercept the countermine, he delays reaching the objective, potentially allowing the defenders time to complete additional countermeasures. He decides to continue toward the objective, but to dig a lateral gallery that will intercept the countermine, creating a confrontation point where his forces can engage and defeat the counterminers. "We'll dig a side passage here," he tells his crew. "When we hit their tunnel, we'll have armed men ready to rush through and drive them back. Meanwhile, the main tunnel continues forward." This requires splitting his limited crew, but it's necessary. Half the men continue excavating the main tunnel toward the objective, while the other half dig the lateral gallery toward the approaching countermine. The lateral gallery proceeds quickly. The miners are motivated by the knowledge that enemy forces are nearby, that at any moment they might break through and face combat in the darkness underground. They work with weapons close at hand, short swords and axes suitable for fighting in cramped spaces, better suited to tunnel combat than the picks and shovels of mining. After 3 days of digging toward the sounds of the countermine, David's lateral gallery suddenly breaks through into the defender's tunnel. There is a moment of shock on both sides as miners stare at each other through the ragged hole in the earth wall. Then chaos erupts. A defender thrusts a spear through the hole, nearly striking one of David's miners. David himself swings his axe, striking the spear shaft and breaking it. Other miners pile into the confined space, weapons swinging in the darkness, men shouting and cursing, the combat brutal and claustrophobic. The fight in the tunnel is nightmarish. No room to maneuver. No light except flickering lamps. The air thick with dust and the smell of blood and sweat. Men grapple and stab in the cramped space, falling over each other, the wounded unable to escape the continued fighting. But David's forces have slight numerical advantage, and the benefit of having broken through into the defender's tunnel, rather than vice versa. After perhaps 5 minutes of brutal close combat, an eternity in such circumstances, the defenders fall back, retreating down their tunnel, toward the castle, leaving 3 dead and 2 wounded behind. David's crew has also suffered casualties, 2 men dead, 3 wounded, 1 seriously. But they have won the underground engagement, have seized control of the intersection point, can now prevent the descenders from using this countermine to threaten the main mining operation. "Collapse their tunnel," David orders. "Bring down the roof and seal it, and someone take the wounded back to the surface." The defender's tunnel is deliberately collapsed by removing its timber supports and allowing the roof to cave in, creating a barrier of fallen earth that the defenders cannot easily clear. This secures the intersection and allows David's main tunnel to continue advancing toward the objective without immediate threat from countermining. But the combat has cost time and lives, has depleted the mining crew, has demonstrated the extreme dangers of underground siege warfare. David requests reinforcements, and Guy de Levy assigns additional miners from other companies, bringing the crew back up to strength. The mining operation continues through the following weeks, the main tunnel gradually extending closer to the southeastern tower. The miners work constantly, excavating, shoring, advancing through earth and rock, enduring the claustrophobic conditions and the pervasive danger. Finally, after approximately 6 weeks of total mining operations, David's tunnel reaches the estimated position directly beneath the tower's foundation. Now the miners excavate a large chamber, a room perhaps 12 feet wide and 20 feet long, its ceiling propped up by numerous timber supports, positioned to maximize the collapse when those supports are removed. "We're under the foundation," David reports to Robert and Guy de Levy. The chamber is complete. When we fire it, the foundation should collapse, bringing down a section of tower and wall. Firing the mine is the final step, filling the chamber with combustible material, setting it alight to burn through the timber supports, allowing the roof to collapse and hopefully taking the tower's foundation with it. The miners spend several days packing the chamber with kindling, brush, and fat from slaughtered animals to ensure a hot, sustained fire. Everything is positioned carefully to maximize the burning of the critical support timbers. On the appointed day, David and a single assistant make the final preparations. They light the kindling at the far end of the chamber, ensuring the fire is well established, then retreat rapidly through the tunnel as smoke begins to fill the underground space. "Fire in the mine," they shout as they emerge into daylight, and the word spreads through the siege camp. Soldiers gather to watch the tower, waiting for the collapse that should come as the timber supports burn through and the mine chamber's roof falls. The wait is tense. The fire must burn hot enough and long enough to weaken the supports sufficiently. If the fire is insufficient, the collapse may be partial or may not occur at all, wasting weeks of dangerous work. If the defenders detect the smoke or the fire and take countermeasures, they might prevent the collapse. But after approximately 2 hours, there is a deep rumbling sound from beneath the ground. The southeastern tower shudders visibly. Then, suddenly, a section of the tower's base collapses inward, the foundation falling into the void left by the collapsed mine chamber. The tower above, now unsupported, begins to lean, cracks racing up its walls. Over the next several minutes, in a gradual but inexorable failure, approximately 30 feet of tower and adjacent wall collapses, falling inward and outward in a tumbling mass of stone, creating a gap in the castle's defenses and a slope of rubble that will allow assault troops to climb into the castle. The siege camp erupts in cheers. The mining operation has succeeded. The combination of artillery bombardment weakening the superstructure and mining collapsing the foundation has created the breach that will allow assault. The way into Chateau de Montfort is now open. Guy de Levy must now prepare for the most dangerous phase of siege warfare, the assault through the breach into the castle's interior, where desperate defenders will fight for their lives, and where the attackers will face the most intense combat of the entire siege. Let us follow Sir Guillaume de Beaumont as he prepares his company for the assault role, examining the tactical planning, the equipment preparation, and the psychological preparation required for this brutal combat. Guillaume's company has been selected as part of the first assault wave, the troops who will storm through the breach, fight their way into the castle interior, and attempt to seize control of key points before the defenders can organize effective resistance. This is simultaneously an honor, recognizing the company's combat capability and reliability, and a deadly assignment that will likely result in heavy casualties. The assault is scheduled for dawn in 3 days, giving the assault force time to prepare, while not allowing the defenders time to adequately repair the breach. During these 3 days, Guillaume must ensure his men are equipped, briefed, and mentally prepared for the ordeal ahead. The equipment requirements for assault troops differ from normal combat. The men will need scaling equipment to climb the rubble slope in the breach, weapons suited to close-quarters fighting, armor that provides protection without being so heavy as to impede movement over difficult terrain. Guillaume assembles his 50 men and addresses them directly. "We've been assigned to the first assault wave. This will be the hardest fighting most of you have experienced. The defenders know their lives depend on holding the breach, and they'll fight with the desperation of doomed men. Many of us will not survive, but those who do will have the glory of capturing a fortress that defied the king's army for weeks." The men receive this news with mixed reactions: pride at being chosen for the crucial role, fear at the known dangers, resignation to the reality that their profession involves risking death. These are professional soldiers who have fought in various campaigns, but even experienced men feel fear before a major assault. "We'll spend the next days preparing," Guillaume continues. "Check your equipment. I want every man with a good sword, a dagger as backup, a shield suitable for close combat. Those of you with crossbows will provide covering fire as we advance, then switch to melee weapons once we're through the breach. Armor should be mail with plate for those who have it, but not so heavy that you can't move quickly over rubble." The men disperse to prepare their equipment. Guillaume watches them go, then turns to Pierre, his sergeant. "How are they?" "Scared but steady," Pierre assesses. "They'll fight well. but we'll lose at least a third, probably more. The breach assaults are always the bloodiest part of a siege. Guillaume knows this is true. Historical accounts of siege assaults report casualty rates of 50% or more for assault troops, with the defenders also suffering catastrophic losses. The confined space of the breach creates a killing ground, where men die in enormous numbers in brutal close-quarters combat. Over the next days, the assault force conducts specialized training. They practice climbing over rubble and rough ground in full armor, learning to move quickly despite the obstacles. They drill in close-quarters combat, shield wall formations for pushing through defended spaces, techniques for fighting in confined areas where normal weapon techniques are impractical. Robert the engineer provides briefings on what the assault force can expect in the breach. The rubble slope is approximately 30 feet long, climbing from the base of the wall to the gap at the top. The slope is unstable, loose stones that will shift under your feet. The defenders will position themselves at the top of the breach, raining arrows and crossbow bolts down on you as you climb, throwing stones, dropping heavy objects. Once through the gap, you'll be in a courtyard. The defenders will have positioned barriers, overturned carts, timber barricades, anything to create defensive positions. You'll need to fight through these positions to reach the inner defenses. This briefing makes clear the challenges the assault force will face. They must climb an unstable slope under fire, force their way through the gap while defenders try to kill them, then fight through prepared positions in the courtyard beyond. Each phase presents opportunities for the assault to fail, for casualties to mount to the point where the attack stalls. But medieval assault tactics have evolved to address these challenges. The assault will be supported by covering fire from archers and crossbowmen positioned to shoot at the defenders. Siege engines will bombard the breach area in the hours before the assault, attempting to kill or suppress the defenders. Diversionary attacks at other points of the castle wall will force the defenders to divide their forces. Guillaume attends the Commander's Council, where Guy de Levi outlines the assault plan. The assault begins at dawn. Artillery bombardments starting 2 hours before dawn to suppress the breach defenses. At first light, archers and crossbowmen will maintain covering fire while the assault force advances. Sir Guillaume's company will lead the first wave, 50 men who will seize the breach and establish a position in the courtyard. They'll be followed immediately by Sir Robert's company of another 50 men who will support and expand the initial penetration. The reserve, 200 men-at-arms, will be positioned to exploit any success or to reinforce if the assault is repulsed. All companies should be prepared for hard fighting. The defenders know this is their last stand. They'll fight desperately. We must be more desperate, more determined. This assault will end the siege. Either we'll take the castle, or we'll be forced to maintain the siege for additional months while we create another breach. Everything depends on the next few hours. As the final day before the assault arrives, Guillaume spends time with his men, checking on their preparations, offering encouragement, sharing a final meal with them. There is a somber mood in the company. Men writing letters to families in case they don't survive, making confessions to the army's chaplain, checking and rechecking equipment compulsively. Guillaume himself experiences the complicated emotions that precede major combat. Fear competing with duty, the desire to survive competing with the need to lead his men effectively, the knowledge that tomorrow he might die competing with the hope that he'll survive and succeed. He checks his own equipment carefully. His armor is good quality mail with plate protection for chest and shoulders, heavy but providing excellent protection. His sword is a well-balanced weapon that he's carried through several campaigns. His shield is a medium-sized kite shield, suitable for close combat, while not being so large as to be cumbersome when climbing. As night falls, Guillaume tries to sleep, but finds rest difficult. Around him in the camp, thousands of men are similarly restless, anxious about the coming assault. The camp is quieter than usual. None of the normal evening conversation and activity. Just men alone with their thoughts, preparing mentally for what morning will bring. Before dawn, Guillaume rises and begins donning his armor, assisted by his squire. The mail shirt goes on first, heavy and uncomfortable but essential. The plate pieces are strapped over the mail. The sword belt is buckled, the sword settled at his hip. The shield is picked up, its familiar weight somehow reassuring. Other men are similarly preparing, helping each other with armor, checking weapons one final time, forming up in their assigned positions. The assault force, approximately 100 men in the first two waves, gathers in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for the signal to advance. From the trebuchet positions, the bombardment begins, heavy stones crashing against the breach area, attempting to kill or wound defenders, to make them take cover, to create confusion and disruption that will facilitate the assault. Guillaume stands at the head of his company, Pierre beside him, waiting for the dawn light that will signal the beginning of the assault. His heart pounds, his mouth is dry despite drinking water, his hands sweat inside his gauntlets. This is the moment, the culmination of weeks of siege operations, the point where all the preparation translates into desperate action. As the eastern sky begins to lighten, Guy de Lévis gives the signal. Trumpets sound across the siege camp, the unmistakable call to assault. Guillaume raises his sword, turns to his men, and shouts, "Forward! For God and the King, follow me!" The assault on Château de Montfort has begun. Guillaume leads his company forward at a run, crossing the open ground between the siege lines and the castle wall, heading for the breach, where a slope of rubble provides access into the fortress. Around him, his 50 men run in loose formation, shields raised, weapons ready, shouting war cries to build courage and intimidate the enemy. The covering fire from the besiegers' archers and crossbowmen intensifies, hundreds of missiles arcing toward the breach area, forcing the defenders to take cover or be shot. But some defenders remain at their posts despite the danger, shooting back at the advancing assault force, throwing stones down the breach slope. Guillaume is perhaps 20 yards from the base of the breach when an arrow strikes his shield, punching through the wood and stopping just short of his arm. Another arrow strikes the ground at his feet. A third hits one of his men in the shoulder, penetrating the mail and causing him to stumble and fall, immediately pulled aside by following troops so he doesn't impede the assault. Then they reach the base of the rubble slope and begin climbing. The footing is treacherous, loose stones shifting under their weight, creating slides of rock that threaten to pull climbers down. The slope is steep, perhaps 45 degrees, requiring hands as well as feet to maintain progress. Guillaume climbs with shield held overhead for protection, his sword awkward in his right hand, but needed for immediate combat once he reaches the top. Around him, his men scramble upward, some making good progress, others struggling with the unstable surface. The defenders' resistance intensifies as the assault force climbs higher. Crossbow bolts strike with tremendous force. One hits Guillaume's shield, splintering wood and nearly tearing the shield from his arm. Another kills the man climbing just to his left, the bolt punching through his mail, into his chest, killing him instantly and sending his body tumbling back down the slope. Stones rain down, not just thrown by hand, but rolled from the top of the breach, heavy rocks that bound down the slope with devastating effect. One such stone strikes a man-at-arms in the leg, crushing bone, his scream piercing through the general chaos of combat. Another boulder misses Guillaume by inches, passing so close he feels the wind of its passage. But the assault force maintains momentum, driven by training, by loyalty to their commander, by the knowledge that stopping means death. Guillaume is among the first to near the top of the breach, where he can see defenders positioned behind improvised barricades, stabbing with spears at anyone who crests the rubble slope. He raises his shield just in time to catch a spear thrust aimed at his face. The force of the blow staggers him, but he maintains his footing, and in the same motion, he swings his sword at the spearman, forcing him to pull back. Another of Guillaume's men reaches the top beside him, then another, and suddenly they are through the breach and into the courtyard beyond. The fighting here is brutal and chaotic. The defenders have created a secondary defense line just beyond the breach, overturned carts and timber barriers, creating positions from which they can fight. Guillaume and his men must clear these positions, while more defenders converge from other parts of the castle. Guillaume finds himself in close combat with a defender armed with a sword and shield, a knight or sergeant, based on his equipment and fighting skill. They trade blows in the cramped space between barriers, both men fighting with desperate intensity. Guillaume feints high, then cuts low, his blade catching his opponent's leg below the shield. The man falls, and Guillaume dispatches him with a thrust to the throat before pushing forward. More of Guillaume's men are forcing their way through the breach now, expanding the foothold, pushing the defenders back. But the casualties are mounting. Perhaps a third of his company is already down, dead or wounded, and they've only just entered the castle. The second wave arrives, Sir Robert's company pouring through the breach behind Guillaume's men, adding fresh troops to the assault. A combined force pushes forward,
gradually overwhelming the defenders' secondary position, fighting through the barriers into the courtyard proper. But the defenders are far from defeated. From the castle's keep, a strong tower in the center of the courtyard, more defenders emerge, launching a counterattack aimed at driving the assault force back before they can consolidate their position. The counterattack crashes into Guillaume's formation with tremendous violence. These are the garrison's best fighters, knights and sergeants, men in good armor with quality weapons, fighting with the desperation of those who know defeat means death. The assault force, already depleted and exhausted from fighting through the breach, struggles to hold against this fresh attack. Guillaume rallies his men, forming a shield wall to resist the counterattack. Hold the line, they cannot drive us back. The two forces clash in a grinding melee, shield striking shield, swords and axes rising and falling, men shouting and screaming, dying and killing in the blood-soaked courtyard. The assault force has numerical advantage, fresh troops continue to pour through the breach, but the defenders have the advantage of position and fresh troops from the keep. The combat continues for what seems like hours, but is probably only minutes. Guillaume is fighting on pure instinct now, blocking attacks, striking back, maintaining his position in the shield wall, barely conscious of individual opponents or actions, simply surviving moment to moment. Then, gradually, the defenders' resistance begins to weaken. The numerical advantage tells the assault force can replace casualties while the defenders cannot. The defensive formation begins to break up, some defenders falling back toward the keep, others surrounded and cut down, a few throwing down their weapons in surrender.
Guillaume sees the moment when victory becomes inevitable. The defenders are broken, no longer fighting as an organized force, but as individuals trying to escape or surrender.
The courtyard is secured. The breach assault has succeeded. Secure the courtyard, Guillaume shouts to his surviving men. Get the wounded out, prepare to assault the keep. But even as he gives these orders, a white flag appears from the keep's battlements, a sheet or cloth waved in the universal signal of surrender. The castle's commander, seeing that further resistance is futile, is offering to negotiate terms. Guy de Levis, who has followed the assault force through the breach once it became clear the attack was succeeding, steps forward to accept the surrender. Cease fighting. The garrison surrenders. No more killing unless they resist. The combat gradually stops as word spreads through both forces. The remaining defenders lay down their weapons. The assault force, exhausted and bloodied, begins to disengage, to check on wounded comrades, to sit down heavily as the adrenaline drains away and the full horror of what they've just experienced begins to register. Guillaume makes his way back toward the breach, assessing his company's casualties. Of the 50 men he led into the assault, perhaps 30 remain unwounded. 10 are dead, their bodies scattered along the breach slope and in the courtyard. Another 10 are wounded seriously enough to require medical treatment. These casualty rates, 40% killed or wounded, are typical for breach assaults. Guillaume's company fought well and accomplished its mission, but the cost has been terrible. He looks at the faces of his surviving men and sees the same exhaustion and trauma he feels himself. The castle has fallen. The weeks of siege operations have culminated in this brutal morning's work, and Château de Montfort is now in the hands of King Louis IX's forces. As the combat ends and the castle is secured, the full scope of the siege's cost becomes apparent. Not just the casualties from the final assault, but the accumulated losses from weeks of siege operations, the damage to the castle, and the fates of the defenders who have surrendered. Guillaume sits on a stone in the courtyard, his armor dented and blood-stained, watching as the wounded are carried to the medical area established in the castle's hall. Army surgeons work frantically to save those who can be saved, to provide what comfort they can to those who cannot. The casualty count from the final assault is sobering. The assault force of approximately 100 men in the first two waves suffered approximately 40 killed and 30 wounded, 70% casualties. The defenders lost perhaps 80 killed and 50 wounded from the garrison of approximately 500, with the remainder now prisoners. But these figures only capture the final assault. Over the weeks of siege operations, both sides have suffered continuous attrition. The besieging army lost perhaps 50 men during the siege, killed by defensive fire from the walls, dying from disease in the siege camp, killed in the underground combat during mining operations, casualties from skirmishes and sorties.
The defenders lost perhaps 100 men over the same period, with similar causes. Moreover, many wounded will die in the coming days from infections, from untreatable injuries, from the primitive state of medieval medicine. The actual death toll from the siege will ultimately be much higher than the immediate battlefield casualties suggest. Guillaume walks through the castle, observing the damage. The southeastern section is ruined, the collapsed tower and wall, the rubble-filled breach, the shattered fortifications that represent months of skilled construction work, destroyed in weeks of bombardment and mining. The courtyard is scarred with blood, littered with weapons and equipment, marked by the violence of the morning's combat. In the keep, the castle's commander, a Cathar perfect priest named Bertrand de Montfort, waits under guard to negotiate the surrender terms with Guy de Levis. These negotiations will determine the fates of the surviving garrison and the castle's inhabitants. Guy de Levis, as a veteran of the Albigensian Crusade, understands the complex politics of this conflict. The Cathars are considered heretics by the Catholic Church, and technically all should be executed or forced to recant. But the practical realities of warfare and politics often require more nuanced approaches. The negotiations result in a compromise typical of medieval siege warfare. The garrison's knights and sergeants who are Catholic or who agree to convert will be allowed to go free, their lives spared in recognition that they were simply doing their military duty defending their lord's castle. The Cathar perfects, including Bertrand de Montfort, will be handed over to church authorities who will offer them the choice of conversion or execution. The common soldiers and castle servants will be released without punishment. This mixed outcome, some survivors, some executions, some forced conversions, reflects the brutal realities of medieval warfare, where military success often led to harsh treatment of defeated enemies, particularly in religious conflicts. As the day wears on and the immediate aftermath of the assault is processed, Guillaume has time to reflect on what the siege has demonstrated about medieval warfare and the methods for breaching castle walls. The siege of Château de Montfort has involved virtually every technique available to medieval siege warfare. Blockade to cut off supplies and reinforcements, artillery bombardment to weaken fortifications, mining to undermine walls, direct assault through created breaches. Each technique has proven necessary. No single approach would have been sufficient to take the strong fortress. The bombardment alone might eventually have created a breach, but it would have taken months rather than weeks. Mining alone would have been slower and more uncertain. Direct assault without the breaches created by bombardment and mining would have been impossible. Attempting to scale intact walls with ladders would have resulted in catastrophic casualties for minimal chance of success. The combination of techniques, applied systematically over weeks, created the conditions where assault became possible and where the defender's situation became untenable. This methodical approach, combining engineering, tactics, and persistence, characterizes successful medieval siege warfare. Guillaume also reflects on the human cost of siege operations. Medieval warfare is often romanticized in later literature and popular culture, but the reality he has experienced is far from romantic. The siege has involved weeks of hard labor, constant danger, brutal combat, and the deaths of many men he knew and fought beside. The mining operations were particularly grim, men dying in tunnel collapses, in underground combat, in near-total darkness, in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. The artillery bombardment, while less immediately dangerous than direct combat, involved its own steady attrition as crew members were killed or wounded by defensive fire. The final assault was simply horrific, men dying in large numbers in brutal close-quarters combat. And for what? The castle is captured, yes. The king's authority is extended over this territory. The Cathar heresy is further suppressed, but at tremendous cost in lives and resources, and with the knowledge that the castle will need to be rebuilt and re-garrisoned, requiring additional resources and effort. As evening falls and Guillaume returns to what remains of his company, he gathers them for a final accounting. Of the 50 men who began the siege with him, 20 are dead. 12 are wounded, 3 seriously enough that they may not survive or may be permanently disabled, and 18 are present and fit for continued service. "You fought well," he tells the survivors. "Better than I could have asked. The king will hear of your valor, and your shares of the plunder will reflect your service. For now, rest, we've earned it." The men disperse to find food and places to sleep, and Guillaume is left alone with his thoughts. He thinks about the men who died, some he knew well, others barely at all all now reduced to names on a casualty list, bodies awaiting burial in a mass grave outside the castle walls. He thinks about the siege techniques he has witnessed and participated in, the sophisticated engineering of the trebuchets and mines, the careful tactical planning, the coordination of different elements, all working toward the common goal of breaching the castle's defenses. Medieval warfare at this level is far from the primitive slugfest that later generations sometimes imagine. It is sophisticated, technical, requiring expertise in engineering, logistics, tactics, and leadership. But he also knows that all this sophistication serves ultimately violent and destructive ends. The goal is to breach walls, to kill defenders, to capture fortresses. The engineering and tactics are impressive, but they are applied to the grim work of making war, of taking lives, of destroying what others have built. As night fully falls and the castle settles into an uneasy peace, Guillaume finally allows himself to fully relax for the first time in weeks. The siege is over. The castle is taken. He has survived. These simple facts are enough for now. The siege of Château de Montfort demonstrates the reality of medieval siege warfare, not the dramatic single battles of legend, but the patient, methodical application of various techniques over extended periods. Breaching castle walls required engineering knowledge to build and employ siege engines, mining expertise to tunnel under fortifications, tactical skill to coordinate assaults, and the endurance to sustain operations for weeks or months against determined defenders. The techniques we have explored, trebuchet bombardment, mining and countermining, breach assault tactics, represent the accumulated knowledge of centuries of siege warfare, refined through countless sieges across medieval Europe and the Middle East. These methods allowed medieval armies to overcome the formidable defenses of castles and walled cities, though always at significant cost in lives and resources. The siege also demonstrates why castles remained the dominant military architecture for centuries. They were extraordinarily difficult to capture, requiring large armies and extended operations to overcome. A determined garrison in a well-provisioned, strong castle could resist for months or even years, tying down besieging forces, draining their resources, potentially allowing relief forces to arrive. Only the introduction of gunpowder artillery in the 15th and 16th centuries would fundamentally change this equation, creating weapons that could breach walls much faster than mechanical artillery could, eventually making the medieval castle obsolete as a military fortification. But in 1244, at the siege of Château de Montfort, we see medieval siege warfare at its sophisticated peak, an impressive combination of engineering, tactics, and human determination that could overcome even the strongest fortifications through the methodical application of force, the willingness to accept casualties, and the patient accumulation of small advantages that eventually made victory inevitable. Guillaume de Beaumont, sitting in the captured castle as night falls, understands this better than any theoretical treatise could explain. He has lived through it, has seen the techniques in action, has participated in the brutal work of breaching castle walls. The knowledge is written in his exhausted body, in his traumatized mind, in the faces of his surviving men, in the bodies of those who died to make the capture possible. This is the reality of medieval siege warfare, impressive in its sophistication, terrible in its cost, effective in its results, and deserving of study, not for romantic reasons, but for what it reveals about medieval military capabilities and about the human capacity to organize complex operations in pursuit of strategic objectives, regardless of the price.